Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Kevin Rudd, President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And yes, I have read Kevin's Not for the Faint-Hearted. I have a very well-thumbed copy, but I have to admit I can't wait for the sequel. Excellencies, our Ambassador to the UN, Gillian Bird, it is an absolute pleasure to be addressing the Asia Society again in New York following my most recent address last September. Although the weather conditions are somewhat different and coming from Perth, this is what I call a storm. Just over a week ago, the leaders of our two nations met in Washington. They reaffirmed the importance of our alliance and the strengthened obligation on Americans and Australians at this moment in history to defend and advance a free, open and prosperous rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. For generations, our two nations have striven for those goals in the councils of states, in the international contest of ideas, and, when necessary, on the battlefield. This mission is continuing. As we look to the future, we must build on our long history of close collaboration and focus afresh on supporting our region, the Indo-Pacific, and in particular on maintaining an Indo-Pacific that is stable and prosperous. It's a region of great opportunity. As the United States National Security Statement attests, it is the most populous and economically dynamic part of the world. However, it also faces some challenges. And as you've said in the past, Kevin, the Indo-Pacific's economic dynamism brings with it a heightened strategic contest that asks new questions of diplomacy. Before I address how we in Australia plan to answer those questions, a few words on the term Indo-Pacific. The term reflects the strategic and economic reality that the most important part of the world for Australia is embraced by these two oceans. It also reflects the reality that India is an increasingly significant feature of our outlook. That flows naturally from India's status as a major player in our region and one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And for me, as a resident of Western Australia, it's only natural to consider the important role of the Indian Ocean nations as well as the Asia-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is the context through which Australia is shaping our approach to the region. Last November, the Australian government published our foreign policy white paper. It's the framework that we expect to guide our international engagement for the next decade and beyond. The white paper identifies that strengthening, promoting and defending the international rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific is our highest priority. The importance of the order, underpinned by evolving network of alliances and treaties and institutions, conventions under international law, cannot be overstated. This rules-based order was developed after the horrors of World War II, when there was a collective will to ensure that we should never again descend into the dark years of global conflict. There have been times when the order has been under direct challenge. It's proven resilient, however, and the peace it has largely brought to the world has seen the greatest expansion of prosperity in human history, with hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty and misery. We need to strengthen and defend the existing order so individual countries and the region as a whole continue to rise economically and peacefully. The rules-based order seeks to regulate rivalries and behaviour and ensure countries compete fairly and in a way that doesn't threaten others or destabilise the region. It protects the rights of small and large countries by preventing stronger powers from arbitrarily imposing their will on less powerful countries. The rules-based order provides mechanisms that allow states to settle disputes amicably through dialogue and according to agreed processes. For Australia, such a use of the rules-based system has come to a successful conclusion this week. As Tom said, I signed yesterday a treaty for the permanent delimitation of our maritime boundary with Timor-Leste. We achieved agreement on this new maritime boundary following a conciliation process provided for under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but the first compulsory conciliation ever undertaken. Through this process, a dispute has become a settlement. A disagreement with our neighbour has been satisfactorily concluded, and the rules-based order has again shown its value in regulating conduct between states. We must nurture and strengthen this rules-based order. We need to collaborate and deploy our tools of diplomacy and statecraft to reinforce an international system that has served our interests and those of so many nations in our Indo-Pacific region and beyond. In doing so, the role of the United States in our region is vital. Australia seeks to encourage and support the strongest possible economic and security engagement by the United States in the region. This must be a defining feature of the next chapter of our alliance. This is complementary to Australia's close engagement with like-minded partners including Japan, the Republic of Korea and increasingly India, all countries which will play an important role in shaping the regional order. We also actively seek ways to work with China, itself a major Indo-Pacific power and a vitally important comprehensive strategic partner for Australia. A strong, stable and constructive relationship between the United States and China is essential to the ongoing health and strength of the rules-based order. While all these elements are important features of our engagement with the region, as set out in our Foreign Policy White Paper, today I want to focus my remarks on our engagement, Australia's and America's, with Southeast Asia. Australia's perspective is that the states of ASEAN are pivotal to any debate about the future of the Indo-Pacific. Geographically, diplomatically and strategically, ASEAN sits at the heart of this important region. It is the collective voice of Southeast Asia. It has helped develop significant parts of our rules-based order, and it convenes the most important diplomatic forums in which the great powers of the Indo-Pacific meet, such as the East Asia Summit. ASEAN lies at the nexus of the Indo-Pacific. Key trade routes that fuel the growth of Asia pass through the waterways of ASEAN nations. All the major economies in Asia, including China, Japan and South Korea, rely on the Strait of Malacca as the vital connection between the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In other important ways, Southeast Asia exemplifies what is fascinating and compelling about the Indo-Pacific region. The states of ASEAN are comprised of fully industrialised and advanced economies, as well as nations that are still developing. The region has been the home to many great civilizations and empires, such as the Angkor Empire in Cambodia and the Paiyu city-states in Myanmar, as well as the Thai monarchy, which continues to this day. Although ancient and more modern rivalries continue to shape interactions in the region, it is a great credit to ASEAN and its members that the region has remained relatively peaceful for decades. A mixture of continental and maritime nations, Southeast Asia's demography varies, some countries with populations in the hundreds of millions and others with a few million. Even though there is great diversity in terms of the political and economic institutions of the 10 member states, ASEAN has bolstered its prosperity by driving economic integration in Southeast Asia and, in the process, fostered peace by building habits of dialogue and collaboration. ASEAN's most advanced economies have also prospered through their openness. Singapore, one of the most open economies globally, has transformed itself, as Lee Kuan Yew said, from third world nation to first. We should learn the lessons of the benefits of economic openness and reflect on the pitfalls of protectionism. Some of the risks of closing markets are very much in our minds today as a dispute over steel and aluminium threatens to widen. For the past 70 years, the United States has been the most critically important supporter of openness and the rules-based system on international trade. This support has underwritten prosperity in the United States and globally. If the current dispute widens and action leads to counteraction, we might see a downward spiral that could put at risk the open trading environment, and that would harm us all. We of course understand the concern for fairness in global trade, but the best response to unfair competition is to use the global enforcement mechanisms that are available, in particular the dispute settlement processes of the WTO. Australia has long recognised the importance of the Asean region. As our foreign policy white paper articulates, we have undertaken to strengthen this effort and to ensure that Australia is a leading security, economic and development partner for Southeast Asia. To do this, we will continue to give priority to elevate the status of our bilateral relationships in Southeast Asia, focus our regional engagement on supporting a prosperous, outwardly focused, stable and resilient Southeast Asia, enhance cooperation on transnational challenges like terrorism, crime and people smuggling, boost our defence engagement bilaterally and through ASEAN-led mechanisms, deepen trade and investment links through concluding a high-quality Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Free Trade Agreement, or RCEP, and building on our free trade agreements with Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia and ASEAN. Partner with Southeast Asian countries on development programs that promote economic reform and inclusive growth, reduce poverty and address inequality, and increase the number of senior ministerial visits. We also continue to be strong supporters of ASEAN's leadership and central role in the Indo-Pacific's most important regional architecture. In particular, we strongly support the vision of ASEAN leadership to entrench the East Asia Summit as the region's key forum for discussing strategic challenges. We've sponsored statements at successive summits that focus the attention of countries in our region on the need to step up efforts in response to security threats such as terrorism financing and nuclear proliferation. In this strengthened focus on ASEAN, a key event will occur in the next fortnight when we host the region's leaders in Sydney for the ASEAN-Australia Special Summit, the first time we will have ASEAN's leaders together on our soil. At the summit, we'll underline our continuing support for ASEAN and its regional centrality, emphasise ASEAN's important role in shaping the character of the Indo-Pacific, discuss how we can partner to respond to the region's challenges and engage with its opportunities, and develop stronger economic integration with this dynamic region. ASEAN is strongest and most confident when its friends and partners work closely with it and are heavily engaged in the region. The United States has been a solid partner for ASEAN over many years. I welcome the Trump administration's strong focus on Southeast Asia and ASEAN, building on the work of past administrations. That focus has been highlighted by high-level contact. For example, Vice President Pence visited Indonesia and the ASEAN Secretariat in April of 2017. Secretary Tillerson hosted ASEAN foreign ministers in Washington in May. President Trump visited Vietnam and the Philippines in November for APEC and the East Asia Summit as part of his broader trip to Asia. In fact, the longest visit to Asia by a US president in more than 25 years. And Secretary Mattis has been very active in the region. To pick out a few specifics, the Secretary visited Singapore in June last year and Indonesia and Vietnam in January this year. Engagement by the United States builds regional resilience and gives countries the confidence and freedom to defend and champion a regional order governed by rules and international law, and where openness and inclusiveness remain the principles that characterise our interaction. Ongoing American leadership and influence is needed to ensure that they endure. In turn, the United States has much to gain from deep engagement with ASEAN nations. The ASEAN region is home to over 630 million people and is collectively equivalent to the fifth largest economy in the world. ASEAN members' real GDP has more than doubled in the last 2 decades, and their growth continues to significantly outpace the global average. The number of middle-class households across the ASEAN region is forecast to more than quadruple by 2030 to 161 million. This is driving mass urban development, expanding cities and a growing consumer class. ASEAN's urban consumers have more discretionary spending power and a greater demand for premium products like cars, high-quality food, including beef and dairy, digital products, travel and education at leading global universities. Regional economic integration is also powering ahead, and much of this is being led by ASEAN through its building of the ASEAN Economic Community and its convening of the RCEP negotiations. A strong and commercially credible RCEP would complement the Trans-Pacific Partnership 11, of which Australia is a member. Even without the United States, the TPP 11 is a landmark trade and economic integration deal for the region that sets high-quality rules and standards that will support trade and investment and job creation. Together with a concluded RCEP, TPP is a pathway to further economic integration and growth for our region, including for the United States, if it so chooses. A further mechanism to engage ASEAN is through infrastructure. Later this year, I expect to formally open the Kaolin Bridge in Vietnam. This 2-kilometre-long bridge will directly benefit 5 million people, and it's estimated that 170,000 people will use it each day. It will be a symbol of Australia's support for Vietnam and ASEAN connectivity. In fact, it was an initiative of Kevin Rudd, and I'm pleased to see it through to completion. Given the infrastructure demands in our region, I hope that Australia and the United States can partner to deliver strategic infrastructure projects such as this in the future. The United States has much to gain by strengthening its economic connections with Southeast Asia. In 2015, two-way trade between the United States and ASEAN exceeded $270 billion US. For the US, ASEAN Business Council estimates that almost 42,000 companies across the United States export to ASEAN. These exports directly and indirectly support more than 500,000 American jobs. In 2015-16, 55,000 students from ASEAN countries studied in the United States. All this boosts both the United States economy and lifts the living standards of Americans. At the same time, United States trade and investment flows help improve the efficiency, professional expertise and levels of innovation in ASEAN economies. To date, American companies have created new jobs and even whole new industries, and new opportunities abound. There is a compelling story to tell of the importance of the United States economy and the tremendous contribution it has made to the emergence of a rapidly growing, prosperous Southeast Asia. It's a powerful narrative which is not being told frequently or persuasively enough. The enormous strength, the impact and the enduring character of the deep economic engagement with the United States must be better understood in Southeast Asia. We all need to tell that story in a way that resonates across ASEAN. Australia and the United States want an Indo-Pacific that is open, prosperous and inclusive, and where the rights of all states are respected. The 7 decades since the end of World War II have proven that a region that embraces these values will be more peaceful, richer, and better integrated. These are values worthy of our energy and advocacy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister. Hello, can you hear me? Good. Well, thank you, Minister, for being with us at the Asia Society, and thank you for your remarks this morning on the Indo-Pacific region and ASEAN within it. Congratulations on the treaty with Timor-Leste. It's been a long, long time in coming. So to all officials and government ministers involved in that, well done. And I think, as you said before, it's a good, robust illustration of what rules actually mean when you use them. I listened carefully to your remarks before, but before we get into the substance of it, back home in Australia, because we're always 14 hours ahead of here, it's just a fact, actually.
A fun fact.
It's International Women's Day already. So you're the first woman to serve as Foreign Minister of Australia. You've had so many distinguished predecessors in that position.
Cue the laughter.
No, but Australia's a very blokey, very macho sort of culture. How's it been?
The past 5 years have been an extraordinary opportunity for me to represent Australia on the world stage. But in the context of International Women's Day, it has brought home to me the importance of role models and mentors. And while one never sets out to be a role model, I'm often contacted by people who say the fact that I am the first female foreign minister gives them hope that others will follow. And long may that be the case. I've certainly drawn inspiration from female secretaries of state here in the US, from Madeleine Albright and Condoleezza Rice to Hillary Clinton. And I hope that in Australia we will see more women take leadership roles. It's something that we embrace as part of our foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, that is supporting the empowerment of women and girls through many programs and initiatives, formal mentoring programs between emerging female leaders in the Pacific and established business women and government leaders in Australia. It's something that I hope we will be able to join with the United States in promoting. But even though it's a priority in our foreign policy, we still have a fair way to go within Australia. And no country has reached genuine gender equality. And so Australia has some way to go. But through determination, through the setting of targets, not quotas, through the collective effort of men and women across our country, I believe we will see more women take their rightful role as decision makers and leaders in our communities, in our governments and across our nation more generally.
ASEAN is the subject of the day, and ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific. A lot of us who have looked at ASEAN over the years have admired where it's come from, this bunch of warring states half a century ago, to an entity of remarkable cohesion relative to what it was. But these days, and this is simply reflecting commentary from within ASEAN itself, the pressures on ASEAN's continued cohesion are large and they are great. Geopolitical pulls, geoeconomic pulls. What's your sense of all that, and do you think there's a role for those of us outside of ASEAN to assist, and if so, to do what, to support ASEAN's continued unity and cohesion?
As my words today have indicated, the integration and cohesion of ASEAN is the secret to its success. 10 member nations have come together over time and have created an extraordinary piece of regional architecture that has increasing weight in regional and global affairs. But you're quite right, through the actions or events in individual member nations, the response to challenges in the region more generally, it is, I believe, difficult for ASEAN to maintain its momentum, and it needs support from others. Australia has been a partner of ASEAN from the outset, as you will know, and we continue to provide whatever support, advice, share experiences, information that we can to ensure ASEAN can maintain, in fact, strengthen its role. But there are events in member states. Let me take an example. What's been happening in Myanmar and the Rakhine State is a challenge now globally. It has an impact globally. It is, I suggest, beyond the capacity of ASEAN to resolve this as much as it wishes to do so. It will need the support of others. It continues to be a significant influence in Myanmar, one of its member states, but it will need the support, the humanitarian support for a start, but also the voices of others to find the solution. Of course, it's also a matter for the United Nations, and while there has been a report from Kofi Annan that must be implemented, there's more that needs to be done. So if one uses that as a case study, it's an example where, notwithstanding the best will in the world, ASEAN needs partners to assist in resolving what is an ASEAN issue because it's a member state, but also a regional and global issue.
The government, in the next few weeks, as you said, is about to host an ASEAN summit in Sydney, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is not an everyday event. It's rare that we have the whole collection of ASEAN heads of government in town at the one time. I think everyone's there, perhaps minus Duterte from the Philippines. So that should be an important gathering. In terms of the Australia-ASEAN relationship, do you ever think there's a day when the ASEANs might accept us as a member?
Well, I'm looking at the ambassadors and high commissioners in the front row.
Most of them are blanched when I ask the question, actually.
Well, they're sort of smiling.
That's what we call the polite ASEAN smile.
Well, I would be the first to say in relation to the East Asia Summit, for example, that the membership of the East Asia Summit reflects the focus and therefore the weight and importance of that dialogue. If one were to accept a much broader membership, whilst that might be a useful forum, it would take away from the significance, the influence and the weight attached to its work. I suspect the same could be said of ASEAN. It has its 10 member states. It knows its mandate and what it's seeking to achieve. To broaden the membership may well take away from its focus. And as much as I would love to join the club, I could accept an argument that they're happy to have dialogue partners and supporters, but to actually have other voices present at their meetings might take away from the openness and the focus and the confidence that they have in each other. So, as Australians so often say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
On the EAS, which you just mentioned, the East Asia Summit, which now is more than a decade old, started in 2005, it's got a remarkable piece of originating architecture in the Kuala Lumpur Declaration. It proclaims itself to be the regional forum for discussing, debating and enhancing regional security. But I think all of us who have observed it have seen it as a very slow institutional start. What do you think of its future? Can it assume a wider security mandate in the region, particularly given all the security tensions that we're all familiar with in this room?
Kevin, slow compared with what? Slow compared with the UN Security Council? Slow compared with NATO? The EU? I'm just trying to think of a whole raft of forums. I think the East Asia Summit, given that its membership includes the United States, China, Russia and others, has been a remarkable success in that the leaders turn up. There's almost a mandatory attendance, that it does grapple with the strategic issues, not just economic and other collaborative areas. It deals with some very difficult strategic issues. And matters have been raised at the East Asia Summit that struggle to be on the agenda of other forums. So I believe the East Asia Summit has a vital role to play, and as I indicated this afternoon, is the preeminent strategic dialogue as far as we're concerned for our region. And for one, I'm very pleased that Australia was able to gain entry to it in 2005. It's a table at which we wish to take our place.
Do you think some of the big security questions of the region, for example, the South China Sea and wider deliberations on regional security, could eventually find themselves more formally onto the agenda of the EAS, and would that be useful if that was the case?
Well, most certainly the tensions surrounding the South China Sea are discussed at the East Asia Summit. Whether there can be a resolution of issues in the South China Sea is more challenging because there are at least 8 claimants. My answer to that would be the place to resolve the competing claims over the South China Sea is through UNCLOS and through the mechanisms provided for under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And having just concluded the first ever compulsory conciliation under UNCLOS since its inception in 1982, I can urge others to see that as a path towards resolution. So while the East Asia Summit can flesh out the differences and the challenges and the risks and the opportunities, the resolution must lie in the parties utilising the existing convention, the existing treaty in UNCLOS to resolve that dispute for each of them and collectively.
I listened carefully to your remarks before. You had a few thinly veiled comments to make about protectionism in reference to no particular
country. Not so
country.
thinly veiled, actually.
Okay. I'm just trained as a diplomat. I was just trying to warm us all up to the subject of what's happened on steel and what the Americans call aluminum, what the rest of the world calls aluminium. I just thought we'd clarify that for our American audience. It's a great language which divides so many countries. It's the English language. And I've seen obviously the national political debate back home on this question as well, and the application of tariffs to Australia. The reaction I see from right across the region, not just from China, is decisively negative. Do you see there's any way through the diplomacy of this, or do you see the administration charging on?
I have no expectation that the administration will change the decision on steel and aluminium. There are, I understand, provisions available through the Commerce Secretary to seek exemptions on a company basis, not on a country basis. So whilst we will continue to advocate that the United States not go down this path, I have no expectation that the administration will change the decision. And one of our conduits, Gary Cohn, is no longer there to push our case. So
he's gone the way of the wildebeest, which is kind of out the door.
And you're meant to be the diplomat.
Yeah. That was
what
before.
What we can do is continue to advocate that the United States not take further action, and that if its concern is the anti-competitive illegal dumping of steel in the United States, the best answer to that is to seek redress through the mechanisms of the WTO. Australia has been subjected to WTO action in the past. We've taken part in it. We've had actions against us. We've won some, lost some. But that's the rules-based order. You take part in those processes. So there are mechanisms available. Our concern, and I think the concern being reflected across the world, is that there will be a reaction, there will be responses, and then you start the downward spiral. What good has ever come from trade wars that result in a decrease in economic activity? We take a much longer-term approach and look at our experience. Around the 1980s, Australia had comparatively high tariffs as part of an ongoing economic reform process that continues to this day. We reduced tariffs. We opened our markets for trade and investment. Australia has now entered this year our 27th consecutive year of uninterrupted economic growth. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a world record. No other nation, no other comparable economy has ever achieved 27 consecutive years of uninterrupted economic growth, and it did not happen by accident. It came about as a result of continued economic reform and the lowering and reducing of tariffs and opening our markets to the world and encouraging our exporters to sell their goods and services into new markets and enhance existing markets, and backed by a series of high-quality, comprehensive free trade agreements, is one of the reasons why we're enjoying that run of economic growth.
So I'll turn to the audience for a few questions in a minute. It's a bit of a worry, though, for us all, isn't it, when the architects of the global free trade order, the United States of America, certainly in terms of the current administration, are heading in the reverse direction. And that and that we see an increasing predisposition for either unilateral actions or Trans-Pacific Partnership withdrawal or revision of NAFTA, will that land in a happy place, etc. But leaving all the details to one side, it's kind of the mega trend which would bother me, and I'm interested in the views of the government on this as to who's left holding up the torch for free trade around the world. There's a few of us, but it's getting a bit lonely, and I begin to wonder whether something starts to crack, and that as opposed to free trade being the future global norm, that in fact forms of protectionism, once regarded as the abnormality, become the new norm.
Nature abhors a vacuum, and if one is created, it is filled. In the case of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had comprised 12 negotiating partners, including the United States, we set out to establish the highest quality, most comprehensive, gold standard free trade agreement that we could in terms of the benefits for the individual members, the strategic significance for the region, and all those other matters on labour market, environment, intellectual property, all the standards. We wanted this to be the best that could be achieved. Of course, we were disappointed when the United States pulled out, but I have to note, in fairness, that both candidates for the most recent presidential election were opposed to the United States entering the free trade agreement known as TPP. What was encouraging and perhaps surprising was that the remaining 11 continued on, and the charge was led, predictably, by Australia, but by Japan. I grew up at a time when Japan, in terms of agriculture, had very strong protectionist tendencies, a very strong agricultural lobby in Japan. Yet under Prime Minister Abe, Japan has been leading the way in opening its economy and being a champion of free, liberalised trade and investment. Had it not been for Prime Minister Abe working with Prime Minister Turnbull and others, TPP 11 would not have occurred, and it is being signed tomorrow by the 11 partners in South America, in Chile, tomorrow. And that gives me hope, because Japan is now seen as a beacon for free and open trade. China has said, President Xi Jinping said at Davos, that it will continue to promote and advocate for free and open trade. Of course, saying and doing are two different things, and there are always behind-the-border issues that have to be addressed. Recently, I was in Central Europe, and we are seeking a free trade agreement with the European Union. And while I know the views of some of our friends in Western Europe, I needed to understand what Central and Eastern Europe think. Some of the strongest proponents of free and open trade are in Central Europe. So in pockets around the world, we're seeing an alignment of commitment to free trade. I hope that we'll be able to conclude a free trade agreement with the EU this year, or at least next year, and then we will commence negotiations for a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom, and they'll be lining up to have a free trade agreement with the UK. So whilst the United States, I hope temporarily, has taken a different path on its advocacy for free trade, and this action on steel gives some weight to that change in direction, I hope that the rest of the world will get on board the undoubted benefit of free and open trade around the world and become collective champions of it. And this may well be the outcome.
Well, it's a gutsy play by Abe, isn't it, historically, against where Japan has been. So full marks to him. Big day tomorrow in, I presume, Santiago de Chile, where it's to be signed. You managed to rope the Canadians back in, got them back on the bus, did you? How'd you do that?
Well, it's a long, long story. Danny Russell's
Tell
here.
us.
He might understand better than most of us. We persuaded Canada that its interests were best served by being a leading voice in the push for free and open trade and a high-quality free trade agreement. It may well have concluded that it would serve it well in its negotiations over NAFTA.
Good. I must admit, those of us who saw the Canadian snafu moment sort of drew breath and wondered what was happening in the bilaterals with Washington at the time between our good friends north of the line here and Washington over the future of that treaty. Any questions from the audience before I start moving towards... there's a gentleman over here. Can I ask that the microphone be handed to you? Just tell us who you are, sir, and quickly your question.
Ken Wasserman. Australia is one of the countries whose immigration policy has been alleged to be racially discriminatory. Can you respond to that allegation?
I reject it utterly and absolutely. Australia is an immigrant nation. We have been built on waves of immigrants from all over the world. Over half our population was either born overseas or has at least one parent born overseas. That immigrant population has also included a significant number of people who have come on refugee and humanitarian visas. In fact, since the Second World War, Australia has welcomed over 865,000 people on refugee humanitarian visas, and we continue to do so to this day. The fact is we're one of the most successful multicultural nations on earth. We have people from every corner of the globe successfully integrating into Australian society, successfully contributing to the richness of our communities and our way of life. There was a level of criticism relating to the action we took to the people smuggling trade, and successive governments in Australia have committed to ensuring that our visa program, that is, we have a universal visa program, is upheld and has integrity. So everybody who comes to Australia comes on a visa. You don't come by paying criminal networks of people smugglers to get into the country. That drew criticism, but we have an immigration system that retains public confidence because the government is in charge of the visa program, and everyone, regardless of race, gender, you name it, must apply for a visa. Student, skilled worker, tourist, humanitarian, refugee must apply for a visa to come to Australia.
Gentleman here, I think, had the call. That's you, sir. And then back to you, madam.
Thank you. My name is Manik Mehta. I'm a journalist. President Trump made a very startling statement, so to say, at Davos concerning the TPP. He held out the hope that U.S. would be willing to join if certain changes were made. How do you read that? And how does it resonate in Australia?
The fact is the TPP-11 is designed as an open agreement. It has open architecture. In other words, other countries can join if they meet the standards, the benchmarks, the principles of the TPP-11. So we welcome other members who wish to become part of the TPP. However, it's not a question of starting again and renegotiating the agreement. The TPP-11 stands, but other economies who wish to join can seek to negotiate their way in as long as the basic principles and standards still apply. A number of countries have expressed interest, not only President Trump saying that they would consider the deal. The United Kingdom, Thailand, South Korea, a number of countries have said that it represents the kind of deal of which they would wish to be a part. Of course, all 11 nations would have to agree, and they would all take into account their own national interest in determining the inclusion of other members.
That lady down here. This lady here. Yeah, that's right, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Lucinda Longcroft. I represent the World Intellectual Property Organization at the United Nations in New York. And WIPO is the specialized UN agency charged with promoting an innovation and creative ecosystem globally. Intellectual property, as you mentioned, is a key part of the TPP. And certainly our data and economic analysis shows that the Asean region, in fact the Indo-Pacific, is leading the field and changing the geography of innovation. China, India, Korea, Japan, certainly outpacing the traditional dominance in innovation of the Anglo-European continents. What is your sense of Australia's strategic position on innovation? What is being done, in fact, for Australia to keep pace with its neighbours in the Indo-China region?
It's most certainly our understanding that the pace of investment in innovation, specifically artificial intelligence, robotics, and the like in Asia is faster than anywhere else in the world. We understand that. Australia has put innovation at the heart of our economic agenda, and our Prime Minister is personally driving an innovation agenda throughout government to set government up as an exemplar. In my own portfolio of foreign affairs, in our aid program, we have established an innovation hub called the Innovation Exchange. We provide it with funding. We look at some of the intractable development challenges in our region and we start again, a blank piece of paper. If we've been investing billions of dollars to try and resolve a development issue and it hasn't done so, we're obviously doing something wrong. How can we bring new technologies, new thinking, new ideas to resolve some of those challenges? And we have about 80 projects underway currently that, should they succeed, will transform lives in our region by being smarter, more innovative, more creative, more efficient use of taxpayers' dollars to resolve problems. It's an approach we're taking across government. It's changing attitudes, changing cultures, changing thinking, but it will work. It must work. And in our interactions with our Southeast Asian partners, invariably we have an innovation partnership, an innovation framework, so we can exchange ideas and exchange people. So there's a flow of ideas and people between Australia and ASEAN countries. It is absolutely essential for economies to compete in the 21st century, for us to realise that one of our greatest assets are in fact our people, their ideas and their enterprise. And I've had some rather eye-opening experiences here this week. I visited IBM Watson, and I just cannot fathom how the world is going to operate in years to come when IBM Watson and similar platforms replace so many tasks that are undertaken by humans today. So one of the big debates that we are having and we must have is, what is the future of work? What is the future of societies where artificial intelligence and other forms of technology are replacing the way we live, work, interact, travel, engage today? And that forms the basis of many conversations within our ASEAN dialogues and beyond.
Robots who perform better than most politicians?
I'll let others be the judge of that.
Okay. We're not an endangered species yet. The one question over here. Oh, sorry. High Commissioner, Ambassador, Permanent Representative. There you go. I've forgotten where I was in the Empire.
Singapore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rudd. It's good to see you moderating this very important discussion. Minister Julie Bishop, pleasure to see you in New York. Thank you very much for the statement. A few quick comments and then a question, or maybe more than one. First, congratulations on the treaty between Australia and Timor-Leste on the permanent delimitation of the maritime boundary. I think it sends a very powerful signal that Australia stands for a rules-based order, and I think it's an important signal, very much appreciated and welcomed by all, including us in the region. Second, congratulations also on the ASEAN-Australia Summit. I think credit must go to you as well as to Prime Minister Turnbull for making this happen. And I think it's going to be the first time, as Mr. Rudd said, that you're going to have almost all the ASEAN leaders in Australia. It sends a very powerful signal to people around the world, but also people in the region, that the Australia-ASEAN partnership is a long-term one. It's an important one. So congratulations on that. Thirdly, thank you also for your powerful statement on ASEAN much earlier here this afternoon. I think it sends a very clear signal of your commitment and Australia's long-standing commitment to work very closely with the ASEAN and recognizing the central role of ASEAN and Australia's dialogue partnership with ASEAN, the first of its kind. I think it's a very important aspect of our external linkage that helps to strengthen ASEAN's cohesion and unity. The last comment before I go to the questions, I'm sorry, Mr. Rudd, this is what ambassadors do, but I'll cut to the
We're
chase.
just finding it culturally challenging because you've said three nice things in a row. We're just not used to that in Australia.
This is Singapore.
Yeah, the last nice thing, we are nice people, Mr. Rudd, in Singapore. The last nice thing I'd like to say is the tremendous soft power of Australia that I think is not often understood and appreciated. And having been High Commissioner in Canberra, I know the soft power that Australia exerts in the region. So the question is, the new Colombo Plan, do you have any plans to expand it? And second, what exactly is Australia doing to reach out to the next generation of people in Asia that Australia is serious about maintaining and strengthening its partnership with people in Asia?
Well, Burhan, thank you for your very generous comments and recognition of Australia's commitment to, first, the rules-based order, as evidenced by the Timor Sea Treaty, and to ASEAN. And thank you for mentioning my baby, the new Colombo Plan. And for those who don't know of this, it means you've never heard me speak before because I talk about the new Colombo Plan constantly. But this was an idea that was built on the original Colombo Plan, which came into being in 1951 after the Second World War as an effort to provide opportunities for young people from war-ravaged countries to come to Australia, study in our universities, gain an Australian qualification and go back to help rebuild their country. And in the case of Singapore, we had hundreds and hundreds of Singaporeans come to Australia and study in our universities as Colombo scholars. And indeed, in years gone by, if an Australian foreign minister turned up in Singapore to attend a meeting of ministers, invariably those Singaporean ministers had gained their first or second degree or even their doctorate from an Australian university. And it just built such an immediate connection between our two countries. So when I became Foreign Minister, I thought, we need to do this again, but in reverse. So I introduced what we called the new Colombo Plan, cunning name change, and it built on the goodwill of the original Colombo Plan, but it was the Australian government providing support for Australian undergraduates in our universities to study in universities in our region and to undertake an internship and a practicum after their studies, so that not only were they living and studying in the country, they were also working. And as you can imagine, this scheme required an enormous level of support from the host countries. In some instances, having Australian students working in their workplaces required changes of the law. And I must thank Singapore for being an original pilot partner. Singapore, Indonesia, Hong Kong and Japan were the original destinations that we trialled this in 2014. Since its commencement in 2014 to the end of this year, over 30,000 young Australians will have lived and studied and worked in one of 40 countries in the Indo-Pacific under the new Colombo Plan. And the connections have been extraordinary. The welcome that the countries have made for Australian students has been overwhelming, and it has been cited many times as a fine example of soft power diplomacy, because we're asking universities in the region to accept our students. We want our students to have had this experience, to have gained part of their qualification from an Indian Ocean Asia Pacific university. And we have young people throughout the region studying as medical students in India, as health students at the University of South Pacific, studying in technology subjects in Singapore. It goes on and on. And we're now starting to get an alumni that will be an asset for Australia for generations to come. And so this has turned out to be an extraordinary example, cited by many leaders throughout the region, as Australia demonstrating a genuine commitment to its place in the world and a genuine engagement for generations to come. That is an example of the level of engagement that we have. And what are we doing to ensure young Australians and young students from the region or young people from the region continue to engage? Precisely this kind of program. We welcome hundreds of thousands of students from Southeast Asia and beyond to Australian universities, and we're now doing what we can to ensure Australian students study in the region. You cannot replace that experience, the understanding that comes from living in another country, the connections, the networks, the perspective that is gained, and I hope that we can expand it and deepen it and make it a rite of passage for young Australians. If you're attending a university, a higher education institution in our country, you can expect to have an opportunity to spend part of your time in a country in our region.
I think it's been a really good initiative. So I only wish I'd have thought about it when I was Foreign Minister. But it does actually, as Julie indicated, add to what we have done as one of our strengths, which is to have this large inflow of students. We established the Australia Awards. I think you still have those going.
They're very important. They're more at the master's PhD level.
Yeah, so we bring literally thousands of students in from right across the world each year, which we fund and support under the Australia Awards scheme. But this does it, as Julie said before, in reverse. So in terms of, I think, building the sort of soft power bridges, which is the basis for your question, I think it's excellent. I'm mindful of the time here. I'm looking at how anxious your staff are becoming. How anxious are you, staff? You're relaxed. That's a very unwise thing to say.
She says, grimacing.
Okay, I'll take a question here, and I'll take one more, and then I'll come back with one to round off with, if that's okay. The lady here, if that's okay? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, it's Emma Reynolds from news.com.au in Australia. There's been talk of the EU imposing retaliatory tariffs on US products. Is that something that Australia would consider?
Australia is concerned at the action and reaction. This is precisely the kind of downward spiral that we fear, and that is if the EU retaliate with tariffs on Levi's and Harley-Davidsons, and then the US retaliates with tariffs on Mercedes, where to from there? It's a no-win as far as we're concerned, and again, I emphasise the fact that mechanisms are available for resolving anti-competitive behaviour. And we understand the President's point about fair trade. We get that. The answer, we believe, is to take action through the WTO. And if there is a dumping of a product in the United States, take action to resolve it through the WTO. We've had, as I said, we've had this experience where action has been taken against us. We've joined actions on behalf of Australian exporters with others, and there have been results, there have been resolutions. And some of them worked in our favour and some of them haven't, but that's the swings and roundabouts of being part of this global open order that has been championed and oftentimes instigated by the United States. And that's the path that we would wish to see countries proceed along.
This gentleman here, and then you, sir, and then we'll bring it back to me.
Hi, my name's Dr. Tony LePere. I'm an ex-sand groper. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I want to ask you, is 30 the magic number, and are we in the presence of a future Prime Minister?
You haven't put me on the spot at all. They often say that 40 is the new 30. Is that what they say? So I have no idea what you're talking about. And, oh, come on. There are obviously a whole range of criteria for maintaining for maintaining one's support. And as many leaders of our party say, for as long as they have the support and confidence of their party room, then they continue as leader. I think John Howard used to articulate that often. And as far as I'm concerned, as Kevin will attest, I'm in a role that I think suits me very well, and I certainly hope to continue to represent Australia as Foreign Minister for as long as I'm able.
Certainly before I became Prime Minister for the second time, I said I was very happy being Foreign Minister too.
Fortunately, there's no comparison between what was going on in your life and mine at that time.
Well, we could start if you'd like, but it's a little late in the day on that one.
Don't you go all Michaelia Cash on me.
All right. I would never do that. I'm much more restrained. A question from you,
Is
sir.
that Cameron Stewart from The Australian by any chance? Oh, goodness. Turn that off immediately.
Yes, behave, Stuart. This gentleman here, and then I'll close up. Yes, you, sir.
Thank you. Richard Howard's my name. I'm an Australian import to the US. And by the way, I have to first of all say, Mr. Rudd, I'm very pleased to see you promoting Australian fashion with the R.M. Williams riding boots. Very nice to see.
I've only got one pair of shoes, and this is it.
Just a quick question, following up on the question from news.com. Would Australia support an action against the US through the WTO if someone were to bring it?
Oh, that's a hypothetical that you know I'm not going to answer. We would obviously consider...
Just try.
We would obviously consider the merits of any action, but we are strong and close and deep supporters of the United States, and we admire the United States' commitment over many years to the international rules-based order. We made it a feature of our foreign policy white paper, and I'm told that our foreign policy white paper was well received in Washington. So we continue to advocate and work with the United States to embrace that order. In this instance, we will be asking that there be exemptions. If that is not able to be achieved, we will certainly encourage the United States to go down the WTO path. If other countries were to take action against the United States, it would depend very much on the circumstances, of course. I mean, our steel exports into the United States are minuscule compared with others, so it doesn't immediately spring to my mind that it would be in our national interest to do so.
Just drawing our conversation towards a close, you've just mentioned the government's foreign policy white paper. There is one country we haven't mentioned all day. It starts with C and ends with A, and it's not Cuba. And we could talk about Cuba if you'd like. But
I have been there.
You have? Okay.
Last year.
Good. We photographed with real living communists as well. So on China...
I was actually photographed amongst a whole group of American tourists who, on the day that President Trump said he would roll back President Obama's rules relating to visiting Cuba, an enormous cruise ship turned up with 5,000 American tourists on it. And I thought, who didn't get the memo?
So on China, in the region, back to the subject, and listening carefully to what you said earlier on about the United States and ASEAN. As we've often said in the region, half the business, if you're a superpower in Asia, is just to show up. It's to be there. And successive American presidents have waxed and waned in terms of their enthusiasm in showing up, and so too for secretaries of state, secretaries of defence. But given the two great powers in the region of our age, the United States and China, and you've just released the foreign policy white paper. As we draw it to a close, outline where you see from the white paper Australia going in the future of its foreign policy and dealing with these 1,000-pound and 2,000-pound gorillas in the living room.
As the white paper makes quite clear, and as I think is quite evident, the Australian government believes that there is no more important relationship in the world than that between the United States and China, and I believe that both nations understand that as well. How they continue to engage will, of course, be a matter of interest to us all. But Australia, to the extent that we can shape our environment, will be working very hard to ensure that the United States and China engage positively. The United States is a known quantity in terms of its commitment to the international rules-based order, and I say that generally, and we will continue our very strong strategic and defence alliance with the United States. It's the bedrock of Australian foreign policy, and I believe will continue to be so. No two countries can claim to be as close as Australia and the United States in virtually every aspect of our respective lives. The United States is our largest economic partner if you take into account two-way trade, we're the number 2, and investment, where the United States is by far the largest source of foreign direct investment into Australia. And it is our only formal defence alliance, apart from our relationship with New Zealand. It's our only formal defence alliance, and our intelligence sharing, our information sharing, our connections could not be closer. China is our largest two-way trading partner, and we have a very important comprehensive strategic partnership with China. And we want to work with China and other countries in the region to ensure that China's rise is peaceful. They have a different history, a different political system, and differences will invariably arise, and they do from time to time. It's how we manage those differences and how we persuade and hopefully shape the outcome that will be the challenge for us all. But in terms of the United States and China, this is why my message, not so thinly veiled in relation to US engagement in Southeast Asia, is so important. The nations of our region don't want to live in a world where they have no options. That they want freedom and they want choice and they want to be able to determine their own destiny. The presence of the United States in our region gives them much greater hope that that will be the outcome. That's why we urge the United States to remain deeply and, in fact, even more deeply engaged in our region. As China rises, its economic weight assists us all. There are 120, 130 countries that now count China as their number 1 trading partner. China will invariably want more say, more influence, a greater military presence. We must all work to ensure that that's done in the interests of the region.
Well, as a former Foreign Minister of Australia to the current Foreign Minister of Australia, thank you for joining us at the Asia Society. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for a highly effective Australian Foreign Minister.